All right. So I know I could just tell by the quiet way you guys were all murmuring to each other that at least you have either you're all pent up things you really wanted to talk about, or maybe you were talking about some of this. But this just highlights the whole purpose of putting on this colloquium, at least from my point of view, is to try to get real dialogue going out in the world. And it doesn't have to be dialogue that necessarily agrees with me, but to have dialogue that can be constructive to go along in this direction is what I really want to see. That I sort of used to keep myself able to keep plugging along with this, waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning and say, geez, I've been fired, I've been all kinds of indignities, etc. Why keep this up? And then I'd go through every year sooner that the world can really purposefully get going and effectively get going on this. This could mean the survival, or avoiding big problems. And how would I feel if I quit and sat down and it took an extra month or an extra year, which might be a dangerous point? So you see, I'm really hooked on this kind of thing, and I hope it's contagious. That's all I got to say. But the plan we have is that we're really getting people to out there to be encouraged, which includes you and the audience here, to be encouraged to get involved and start contributing thoughts and arguments and examples, etc., and links. And the more that what you contribute is integratable effectively into a dynamic knowledge repository, the better. So without having the kind of funding it would really take by any stretch of the imagination, we're using volunteers to just sort of get an initial sort of way in which the dialogue can get going, and we can build up documents and actually learn how to harness this the kind of video record that's going on here. So anyway, this is something that you need to get registered in there, because we want to be able to have the right that anything people contribute can be integrated into an open kind of knowledge base that's growing. So we don't want to run into entanglements that people have contributed something, and if we do make it generally integrated in public, that they'll say, wait, that was a private, not meant to be that way. So anyway, it's causing us to a little bit regrettably putting in some of this red tape, but we're really trying to encourage this, and we'll talk more about that every session and in between. So anyway, in looking at this frontier and trying to look at it with the scale of the change and say, it isn't just your company or your university or your political organization or something that's got to move out of here. It's the whole environment you're going to be in is going to be moving. So every one of these little dots that's an organization will be moving and trying to find its own way out there. Excuse me. And I should use a one-button mouse, I guess. That's been one of my paradigm issues ever since. The one button for a mouse is just wasting digits.
Not a 5-button mouse.
Yeah. Well, people ask me why our early mice only had 3 buttons, and I said, well, that's all we could put in it. That was the deciding point, because of the technology we had then and the funding we had available. So yes, 5. Anyway, now you distracted me. What was I saying? I must have been heading on some... Next slide, okay. Hey, how'd I get to... I found a new button. Okay. So, some of the things I was doing in this last 20 years, after being sort of and gently nudged out of the research world, was be part of McDonnell Douglas Aerospace. And it was very, very useful education to just see, seriously considering how you could bring this sort of thing into the design world, and then realizing that the design and the manufacturing need more and more in their planning and setting up to be integrated. And then they said, oh, that isn't all, and they showed me this picture of the tiers of suppliers that go into. So this was what was, they said, typically for a fighter plane, these guys were in the fighter plane area like that, they said that you might have up to 2,000 people in the major contractor work, doing the designing and all of that in there like that, in the manufacturing control. But you might have a couple of hundred first-tier suppliers, that these are people that you say, oh, you know, we putting up the specs for the rest of it, and we want you to be doing the landing gear or the radar or something of that sort. So what they do in the design, these first-tier guys, has to be very closely integrated with the requirements and planning and specifications, and the specifications have to go on down. And then when any one of these things finally gets a contract, it's sort of specifications have been going back and forth, and if any of them or the requirements change, trying to keep that up to date is a real challenge like that. And then when they do ship a product to get assembled up in here, every one of them has to have been tested, and the test records of that product have to be connected with it, so you have to know which airplane and which shift under which supervisor of the assembler like that these went into, so later they can go back when things are out in the field and really backtrack on problems that occur like that. And now that just said, when they showed me that, and I realized that, oh, and the kind of knowledge packages that you're going to be building are going to get more and more sort of sophisticated. And oh, that vocabulary sense, so the way the objects that are describing in there are encoded and described in the language they're in, and then the way the functionality and the tools that are used, and they just at least the verbs and nouns. So he says it just cannot possibly be by separate vendors who each have their own way of doing it. Just impossible. And it's sort of building by specs. You can have separate vendors producing something that are by standard specifications, just like you can buy a lathe from any number of manufacturers, and you can have the language about, you know, they've got to have these very basic sort of things that are in common, that standards, etc., but they can't start changing or pushing. So the way that the digital technology has kind of emerged into the knowledge work world is kind of evolving out of that automation world like that. And it hasn't yet really got on to the changing of the vocabulary that would allow it to get away from WYSIWYG, for instance, easily. And the very early model of a graphic user interface has just stuck because it was easy to learn at the time, and that's the only interface you have. But really, I'll tell you about more of the pictures about all of that that have evolved through the years about how that needs to be set up, and not just totally wishful thinking, but this open hyperdocument system, it just has to evolve. And there's nice things happening in the World Wide Web, that there's a XML work group, and the young man that organized that and runs it now is sitting right over there. He'll hide from you, but are you flappable?
On occasion.
Oh. So anyway, that the way in which the standards need to get set was just very, very important. But again, there has to be more exploration in pushing about, okay, what do people want in the properties of the objects in there that are encoded into the knowledge packages, so that you can grab them and do things and see things, etc., that are there, and how kind of functionality you want to apply it with them, which affects quite a bit about the implementation and the standards you're going to affect in that. So we just really have to go about that. So this open hyperdocument system just has to be, its pursuit has to be an integral part of any really serious pursuit about getting to be solving the kind of large-scale problems we're talking about in this knowledge world, etc. So that's become part of our framework in that. And thinking about that was what affected a lot this system that we called NLS back in the 60s and 70s. And when it got pulled out into the commercial world, it was called Augment, etc. So it has a lot of of things built into it that we're assuming. that this was going to have to be evolution like this, in an evolutionary way that was an effective evolution, etc. So later on in the colloquium we'll be talking about that a lot. So there's another part of all that, though, that if this is going to evolve in the functionality that supports the use and the storage and the transmission and the reliability of these documents, etc., there's just a lot built into the software technology of that. So we have another video clip voluntarily provided by Peter Neumann, who has been working in the security and reliability area for many, many years, and most of them from SRI, where he's still employed. And so you'll find out the energy that he has there. So let's roll on Peter Neumann.
I've been involved for most of my professional life over the past 46 years in systems that are very reliable, very secure, in some sense highly survivable in the face of arbitrary adversities, whether it's security attacks, hacker attacks, or hardware malfunctions, or software failures, or cosmic radiation, or any arbitrary type of difficulty, including squirrels eating through cables and animals behaving in strange ways. And the challenge here has always been to design things that are better than what you get out of commercial products. Even in my doctoral work, I was worried about communication systems that were able to withstand arbitrary adversities. So for the last many years, beginning in '65 when I was working on Multics, and throughout the '70s, '80s, and '90s at SRI, I've been concerned with very reliable, very secure, complex systems. We built probably the world's first fly-by-wire computer, a 7-processor self-diagnosing, self-reconfiguring system with voting on critical tasks that ran for years and years in the NASA laboratories on the ground. And we designed some very secure systems. Even back in '65, we recognized the relevance of the Y2K problem 35 years out, and developed a system that did not have the Y2K problem. This is sort of symptomatic of the difficulties in dealing with complexity. The incredible lack of foresight. The Y2K problem is one symptomatic example of that. A lot of the modern operating systems are other examples of it, particularly the PC software, where you get enormous bloatware, millions and millions of lines of code, most of which is inherently untrustworthy. So the challenge is, how do we build systems that in some sense are very reliable, very secure, very robust, highly dependable, interoperable with other systems, capable of robust networking, despite the fact that over and over again we see all these hidden flaws, hidden fault modes, hidden security problems. The Y2K thing is one example where for years and years we've recognized the problem and yet nobody's done anything about it. The security of operating systems is another example. The typical vendor software is so riddled with security holes that one wonders why anyone would ever want to buy it, and the answer is that most people don't seem to care. Now, as we get into the world of internet commerce, for example, it does matter all of a sudden. We've had the eBay outages, 3 different outages, which caused them a great deal of business loss and loss of credibility. We've seen the AT&T collapse of 1990, where you basically couldn't make a long-distance call for half a day. 10 years before that was the ARPANET collapse of 1980, where essentially a fault mode, an isolated fault in one node, contaminated every node in the entire network. The same thing happened 10 years later in the case of the AT&T systems. So here we have the problem of building very robust, secure, reliable, networked systems, despite the inherent complexity of what we're doing. One of the normal challenges is keep it simple. This doesn't work when you're talking about missile defense systems and enormous financial systems and things of that nature. So we have to learn how to deal with complexity. And what is required is decent requirements in the first place, which we normally don't have in any system development. A good system design, a good system architecture that is inherently capable of robust behavior. Decent software engineering practice, which we very seldom find. The buffer overflow problem, for example, has been around for decades and continues to haunt us. Every year there are another group of major security vulnerabilities that result from buffer overflows. Bad programming practice, bad operations, bad maintenance. System administrators are under tremendous pressure to keep systems up to date with all of the thousands of patches that are being released constantly. This is not the way to run a business. You'd like operating systems that are intrinsically more secure. You'd like application software that is inherently more robust. Now, we tend to always blame it on the operator or the user or the system administrator, but if you look at some of the cases of pilots who get blamed for aviation problems where the interface to the computer system was a disaster, blame it on the operator, blame it on the pilot. Don't blame it on the computer system is the immediate knee-jerk reaction. And this is a joke. If it weren't so sad and so serious, it would in fact be a joke. But it's not a joke. It's very serious. So we're living in a world where we'd like to be able to deal with complexity. Fred Brooks suggests that you build one to throw it away. This never happens. What happens is you build a prototype which has no security, no reliability, no availability, no fault tolerance in it, and then you start growing it. And what you wind up with is a monolithic bloatware system with millions and millions of lines of code that has no security, no reliability, no availability, and any of these other things that we need. The bottom line here is that we need new paradigms for system requirements, new paradigms for system development, new paradigms for programming that don't inherently result in buffer overflows and all of the other reliability problems and security flaws that we see over and over again. And one of my favorite architectures is one in which we have very thin client user systems, basically no operating system that is overwritable or changeable, and very little that can be affected in the client system, with a lot of trustworthy servers around and trustworthy distribution paths, and perhaps even a lot of open source code rather than the proprietary bloatware that we continually run into. And the course that I've been teaching in Maryland for the past year has explored all of these issues in some great length. All of the notes are online, and I think you might want to take a look at some of that.
Well, thank you, Peter. He's sitting right there. I have a feeling we're going to get him back or get him involved, which is one of the things we'd like to just say is, we've had a parade today of complex things with urgency, etc. And one of the things we'd like to do is start collecting more and more cases and instances of those in our own emergent dynamic knowledge repository. And that alone would probably take a staff of 5 or 6 people coordinating with, an external group of hundreds of people around the world helping do it. In a way, that's what the UN global, what's it called, Millennium Project has been doing. And so Jerry Glenn is going to be here one of these days. I keep forgetting which one. And Peter and he have been interacting, so they're going to give you a closer push on that. But the basic thing is, even if we had everybody speaking all the time here, we wouldn't be able to cover them or integrate the perceptions that brings out in it. And you realize that almost every one of them, the big problems, has organizational, social ones. They have the funny social thing in the economic world of the marketplace put so much pressure on every CEO to get next quarter's profits up. It's just unbelievable. So no way can they, under that thing, produce a healthy evolution of their company. But that's sort of the way the outside world is, and it'd be very, very complex to try to change it. But if it's not changed, you know, I get a picture sometimes of a very smart species of ants, and they found a really effective way to live, and they built a nest up in a tree, and they were just so effective. They multiplied, and whoopee, everything was just great, until one day they got so heavy the branch broke and dropped them into the water underneath, and they all drowned. See? But you suppose you could have told the boss ants that that's what's going to happen? Oh, that's, you know, anyway. So someplace the kind of perceptive, demonstrable, provable arguments, etc., have to be able to be made to become a part of what so many of the rest of the world needs to live with all the time. Whether that's political or whether it's people with different strong religious beliefs that aren't going to do something, well, that's okay, unless if it's not driving the rest of us into some crunch and this like this. So anyway, there's a lot of push. So one of the things about how are you going to start evolving things? So it just went back to make a very simple sounding conceptualization. It's just saying, well, let's just look at all the activity that goes on every day in your organization. And this could be anything, the way your university runs, you know, the way your Boy Scout troop runs, the way your city is governed, the way your company runs, etc. So they're running along, and they know how to do things, and they can hire people to train them to do the jobs, etc., and describe it, etc. So they do, and they can put out new products because they know how to market the machine, etc. So then you say, okay, if they need to boost their capability, then let's just relegate that activity to a separate kind of activity. It may be the same people just putting on that kind of hat or something, but let's just separate those activities. So let's call that other one a B. And B is the thing that actually is going to plan and design and implement any improvement, which includes conditioning the people that are going to get affected and training them how to do it, etc., and holding their hands while they stabilize on a new way of doing something. So that's all B stuff. So you can just see about that frontier opening up like that, and my God, there's so much more movement that you're just unavoidable. You're going to get pushed in directions if you don't. So you better choose to sort of do a little bit of planning and explicit implementing of your own about it like that. And then there's another thing about saying, oh, you know, that's a activity that has to take unprecedented kinds of tasks. Now, because of the change in the environment and the change in all the potential, the technology and all kinds of other things bring about. So I got both potential and my environment's changing. So, okay, I can't stay still, so I have to move. So how do I know which direction to move? Oh, and how do I learn the new kinds of skills, etc., and knowledge that I need to have in order to pick a place that we're going to move to this next year and put the forces together to do it. So let's just give that as another category of activity as C, see? And, you know, I was tempted to get a D and an E and an F like that. I know there's smart people that are going to be telling me, hey, what about improving the C? Wouldn't that be a D? Yeah. And an E and an F. But every one of those higher alphabetic things is improving and improvement. You know, improving and improvement. So it just got so enough recursive, I said, well, we'll turn it off at C. And because if you outsource your C, if you hire consultants to come in and do your C, then that's their A work. See? So then you realize that their B is your D and so on. So in the kind of infrastructure we could picture, you could just have great alphabetic soup. So the A, B, and C give us enough interesting things by itself. So we made a lot more progress in that than we probably thought about when this emerged about 10 years ago. So one way to think about it is, that's the C role. Is there a scout? You've got a frontier out there and they're a scout. And great. So that frontier explodes like it is. God, there's a lot of territory, a lot of multi-dimension space out there, and a lot of things going on, and a lot of ideas floating around. How in the world to do a good job of C then is going to take more budget than you spend on even doing the B work. So this comes about it. But then the B is the sort of the wagon train boss. He's going to take us all out to the next place in that frontier. So there's two roles get kind of clear when you look at that frontier sort of picture and its multi-dimensions. So this is the kind of thing we move ahead on and look at it. So what would we do if we get that? Well, one thing to do is saying, look how much C can cost. Oh, let's look up and down the highway or the street or the state or something and find other organizations that are doing similar things that have similar kinds of problems in the B. And why? Oh, because why don't we start collectively sharing some of the work and energy and resource and cost that it takes to do a good job in C? Well, you don't have to look at that too much before you begin to realize the scale of that frontier opening up like that. Scouting that out and try to find there is really something, and it's not enough. The professional societies that are having more and more meetings intensely trying to do it, or the consultants that are trying to do it, they don't have enough resources, enough input. It's a big, big job. So doing it collectively has a big advantage. And you'll say, well, why don't I farm it out? Consultants could do it. And you'll say, well, I tell you why. Because the way we should run this C community here, we call it improvement community, and that term is now another one in the vocabulary that we'll be using all the time. So I'm going to make the next one of these things flat. Then I'll be as famous as for doing the mouse. Who would have thought? No, maybe put a thumb brake on the mouse. How about that? We could spend our time inventing here. So in this C community, it's really, really interesting to think about the work that's there. And this came out of our thinking about a decade ago, and that somehow then I stumbled upon the whole quality movement and realized, oh, that's been a big kind of the way that they've done their quality movement, that they get together a lot and share. And for a while we were having very intense meetings where people are gathered, every month or so, and we're planning how to do all this thing. And one of them was saying, hey, we just won the Baldrige Award, and now we got these executives running around who always used to be very worried about any things getting out to our competitors. And now they're doing this marvelous sort of statement of saying, oh boy, compete like hell out the front door and cooperate like hell out of the back door. And so that quality movement still was a really good example in this, but it's something to do that every consortium or in a sense, every one of a company's employees that goes out and works in a trade association or a professional society is essentially doing this. They're sharing a lot, and there's just no way you could get about it. And there's another very, very important thing that we get to if we say, oh, this C community is doing, okay, think Bootstrap, click. Oh, why doesn't this C community start operating like a very advanced sort of collectively intelligent outfit? In fact, it turns out to be a very good place to invest special resources in pilot operations that are actually working pilots of how you do collective knowledge work a lot better, which need to be done out in the open so that you're sharing about the evolution of the standards and the vocabulary that has to go on. So great. So we just added a term we call these networked, just for the sense of doing this sort of networked way. And so we could use the term NIC. And then one interesting thing is that in some of our meetings we had some years ago when the term was first coming out, people says, well, you've got this this improvement community of yours, it's an ick, isn't it? And so they'd start pronouncing ick and say, hey, why don't you get with it and turn your ick into a nick? So a positive term, a nick. So anyway, so this is part of the kind of improvement infrastructure potential that we've been trying to highlight and study and think about. But it takes a lot of input of people to think about all the pros and cons and work out the guidelines and try to get a sort of a business case for doing this that would sell for hard-nosed people, and also go after examples, etc., to use. But also, that's one of the prime places in which you could do prototypical dynamic knowledge repositories, because you've got a lot of people cooperating in it. They could sort of share the costs and the sort of risks of doing that. And then this comes about another thing of why this kind of setup you couldn't duplicate with a consultancy, is that this thing should be staffed by people contributed voluntarily for a certain period of time by the people out here in the customers of this. So these people are there really living in this advanced prototype environment, really living with advanced ways to cooperate among themselves because they're given the resources, the time, and the encouragement to do it. And when they go back, they not only have the knowledge, the intrinsic kind of knowledge that's very hard to produce by just knowledge packages, and they also have the experience in there. So it just grows to be a very attractive thing. And we said, oh, how come we thought of that? I don't know, it just evolved. So it turns out it's a very good one. So then some years later we said, well, it's a very important thing to learn how to do this, right? And just as it's very important for this Nick to be helping these people learn how they become better and better bees. Oh, why didn't we think of this earlier? Oh, why don't we go out and find interesting Nicks and have them get together with an improvement community for how you improve Nicks? Where the focus here is on how you get to be better and better to Nick. And he says, oh, and you start looking into that, which we will do for the rest of Colloquium, is dig into these kind of examples and look at the problems and talk to people who have improvement communities and get them involved to say, what's the problem and the challenge of improving, changing this? Just like we'd like to get into dialogue with organizations that would be progressive enough to say, hey, boy, there are some kinds of capabilities, especially this knowledge work and collective intelligence, etc., that we should probably keep up to bit. So why don't we sort of find a good nick to join and get active in that? So these things of how do you develop the candidacy and the sort of value proposition to organizations to become members of an active NIC. How do you talk to active improvement communities about becoming NICs? How would you talk about a bunch of NICs and determining how would you like to come into a Metaneck that we ended up calling the Bootstrap Alliance, like that? Well, when does it stop? Well, there isn't any reason why in different countries you could have their Metanecks talking into a super one, or even the different states having a Metaneck for the federal, etc., and so on. So that the potential for a multi-level infrastructure of this seems to be right there to study, and with the energy and sort of grasp of detail that it's limited, believe it or not, but I can't get in it. So it's the kind of thing where we say, look, it isn't going to happen unless we get a bunch of people moving anyway. And if they're going to be moving, they need to have a sort of strategically organizing framework in order to do that. So we'd like to offer this as the framework for organizations to do their evolving. And this should go to say, hey, you know, why not every state has its own kind of nick inside it for all of the things it has to sort of foster about the improvement of operations within the state. Well, then you'd have one for all the states. Well, maybe the states have encouraged the counties. Well, then they could tie together the counties. So we've actually been fortunate enough to resonate and connect with an organization called the National School Board Association, that it has 50 states and 3 regions, or whatever they call it. So there are 53 members of it. Each of them covers a region or a state. And then those have different other down and like that. And you say, boy, if we're going to improve K-12 education, you know, the school boards definitely have to be involved, because they have to sort of be able to help monitor and control how things are happening. Then somebody else points out, oh, we've got to get the parents in each community organized. How do they get educated and trained? Oh, the teachers also. Oh, the principals also. Oh, the superintendents also. So those are all those candidates for somehow they all have to migrate in their roles out there. And then the whole possibility is the new way of working together might offer a very different structure by which those different schools are put together and organized and monitored or regulated or guided or whatever like that. So this is all the case. So anyway, there's just a lot to think about here in this sort of Metaneck and Nick sort of thing. So one of the interesting things then comes about is saying, oh, if we were going to go out and we had an alliance, a Metaneck put up, like we've got one as a not-for-profit corporation already set up, waiting for some Nicks to come and knock on the door. And so we say, okay, which ones would you like? Oh, let's go out and survey the different improvement communities in the world and say, well, which one of those, if we got them involved as Nicks, that the products of what they're learning how to do not only would improve their, but come back and improve the Metaneck. See, the bootstrapping. So we made a beeline for the Association of Computing Machinery. It's the largest computer society in the world, which has a bunch of special interest groups. And so we knock on their doors and say, oh, you know, so there's a SIG-Chi, computer-human interaction, and a SIG-Web that's really a hypermedia work, and there's a SIG-Group for groupware, and so on. And we actually knocked on the doors and started getting interest about them, but it runs out of gas because the structure that's there and how the financing is done just aren't really very shiftable. For instance, a lot of them, the publications that they sell are part of the revenue that they get, which makes a difference in how they could run. Well, in the world that's going to come, you're not going to have hard copy circulated like that. You're going to publish online, and then you're going to evolve from there. Oh, academics point out, oh, but look, it's so important for us in our own circle, in our own society, that we have our papers get reviewed by peers, that especially the ones that go in the highest quality journal, because the number of papers we get in those high quality journals is a very important part of how we get rated as doing our job as researchers in universities. So I had one one professor in molecular biology or someplace like that get really angry with me, almost like the information retrieval people did 20, 30 years ago. It says, you just don't understand the academic world. You know, there's no way that you're going to break that. Peer review system has been tested, time tested. And I'll say, well, let's talk about it a while. I know that getting yourself reviewed of how much contribution you're making is important, but why does that have to be done before you publish? Oh, because it puts it in the best journals. Well, look, why don't you just publish when you want to, right out there in the world, and there'd be links, and the professional societies would actually have links and stuff into it so people can find you, no trouble at all, and read you. And then why don't you have a way in which the sort of commentary about you and the approval, and that you get a dynamically rated sort of system going along that just is continuous. And so if your paper suddenly nobody likes it first, but 9 months later, oh, they find out what it really meant and how it fit into something else here. Oh, great. Well, in the way it is now, you would be, if you'd been published, it would have been some second-rate thing or something, and you might not have gotten it published. But anyway, and what if it would sit there for longer? Or what if it's a really good thing that was really hot and gave you all that credit, and they found out a huge flaw in it a year later? So the dynamic attributions of who's contributed to what is just a part of how this dynamic knowledge repository and its environment is going to have to work. And you want it there anyway. As if you're part of a big crew of people designing, producing aircraft, you know, it's hard to put your own best ideas out there and want them to get lost. You know, but that's what it's going to take to have a team design and a team evaluation stuff do it right. So the business about backtracking on backlinks into doing attribution or something is a real challenge, and be extremely important in actually the sort of social aspect of getting this knowledge stuff shared, people contribute as teams, And it may make it that a guy will get to be a full professor in 5 years after he's an assistant professor, because he puts out nothing much more than paragraphs at a time that just really hit and do it. And you never get there it is now, so it's better. So I'm going to ask Terry later, Terry, about the real world of universities. How likely is this to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? But anyway, the rest of the institutions in the world are all going to be evolving, and if universities don't, then they're going to be obsolete. For one thing, you says, hey, as the total knowledge in the world is increasing in its rate of being produced, and if it gets down to be every year and every 6 months and so on like that, that everybody out there in a professional job has got to be learning all the time. So it isn't going to be any more that your college education plus what you pick up on the job with just osmosis is going to be enough to keep you in key. You're going to have it. So who's going to be providing something that has to be an organized, really advanced way to get not only new knowledge out there, but the ways in which you shift from the perception of knowledge you did have into the way the new frameworks of knowledge are going to be. So that's the kind of a role that universities have now, or something. Well, it's got to be provided through a person's working life in not too many years or decades from now. And if the universities don't shift to be able to handle that change in the external world, then what are they going to do? This one period here, and if it's not compatible with the way it's going to continue, nobody's going to want to go through that one. The same thing will happen in K-12, that more and more there's be just a continuous evolution like there has been. You've been reading out of books. You start doing that when you're, say, 5 or 6. Huh? So you're going to start learning about the way in which knowledge is packaged, optional viewing, moving around, verifying, etc., very early, because the earlier you learn that, the more power that gives you for climbing the hill and toward more knowledge. See, like that. So that means education can't be divided up anymore like that. So there are lots of things about the future that, looking at this kind of scale we have to be dealt with. So anyway, this high bootstrapping index is an important one about what kind of groups to sort of encourage the most. So I'm going to be trying to get the ACM president to come in, and I've given a warning about this, and maybe some of the people in some of the special interest groups as examples of talking about the problems and difficulties and challenges. And this is what we'd like to do from different kinds of organizations. I'm acquainted with a guy that's a state senator. I think he's a representative. But he's been very active for many years and very interested in education. So what does it look like from there? The organizational things you need. Well, Jim Spore's built up a very interesting educational cooperative activity for some years with NSF funding, and a lot of things they learned there, and including backlink attributions, which was a good comment. So we got him tapped to come in later too. So anyway, this is what we would really like to encourage, is for people to start bringing up and making us aware of more of the cases of organizations or improvement communities, etc., that are out there that need, are good candidates and from whom you can learn, as well as what's out there in the way of really novel tools and processes for doing the kind of knowledge work we're talking about, as well as the processes for, every NIC and every Metaneck is really a community of distributed participants, and there's going to be a lot to learn to how you cultivate and develop that community, and in a sense they're going to be managing more and more evolution on their own and change and resources to invest, so they have to have a governance process that gets to be better than they are now. So the whole business about distributed governance is an important thing, and then that needs to be phasing in with the practices, etc., about the way you govern many things in our political world, etc. So all these things are going to be evolving simultaneously. And so anybody that starts out, I'm going to go fix education, but doesn't have the resources or the orientation to be looking at simultaneously at the rest of it, is sort of like, I'm going to get this horseless carriage, but of course people ought to steer it like they ought to steer it, with reins and stuff like that. So that's so then we talking about the scalability of all of this, etc. And this sort of accidentally, but a fair amount through Jeff Rulifson's perseverance and thoughtfulness and trips to Japan, and then Christine and I went with them, and what emerged from Japan is an organization that's actually called the Bootstrap Alliance Japan. And its president is sitting right there, Dr. Ahashi, who's a university professor, and he actually made a video to put in today's, but we didn't know for sure we were going to get it in time to integrate it, so we'll see another time. And you're here for the reception later this evening, and are you going to come back every week?
You should be able to see it. They have it.
Oh. Well, Marcelo, who's been in charge of that, says we might actually have time, so we need to get through a few more things so we might be able to run it. So don't go away and hide. But all right, let's boost a little bit here. But anyway, that we're then saying, okay, the Bootstrap Alliance, we'll say the one we have now, the thought of saying, well, let's just make that the Bootstrap Alliance USA, and then we get a little bit of interest from Australia, and then we get to push some doorbells in Singapore, and some people in Norway with their oil money, and then it starts growing about the people that say, oh, hey, we could start getting something like that going in our country. So every country, or really every nationality, with its different cultures and different environment, etc., needs to have its own way of evolving at the same time as being interoperable with the rest of the world. So they need to be international in their sort of Metaneck environment. But they also need the freedom to evolve the way they do. And, we might just really learn that the Japanese focus on processes and stuff might find them suddenly surging ahead of us. So that's why we want to keep him on a short leash, so we sort of know about that. So anyway, the thing that we really seriously thinking about in this bootstrapping pursuit is that the concurrent evolution of an open hyperdocument system is just a very critical sort of necessity. So that's something where all the NICs and Metanecks and national NICs of the world would really need to be serious about getting together with. So part of the dynamic knowledge development, etc., very early has to be that you get focused and get proactive end-user organizations and proactive sort of vendors, etc., involved in that in a way, and really proactively trying to explore, hey, how do we want these things to evolve? And we don't want to get stuck in the same way that people get stuck with a WYSIWYG, where that's the only view you're going to get. We don't want to get stuck with people's perceptions about, hey, this is the way you've done knowledge all the time, so this is the way, and you say, well, wait a minute, we're very, very flexible in our changes in the way we sense and perceive things and process them and such like that. We're very flexible. If anybody can learn to ride a skateboard or something or do a lot of other things, we can certainly learn different ways that we can harness ourselves to something like that. So this leads to saying that it's just a special part of the strategy has to be something that provides for that kind of open evolution. And so one of them is that you really think seriously about putting together teams of people that are equipped and trained and employed in ways that really are demanding high performance. And you're not going to put any constraints on what they do. They can do whatever they want to if they want to try it like that. But in a competitive sense, they need to have a performance assessment process that also grows within these communities so you can rate them. This team is just terrific for this part of what's done in trying to do the integration. And this one's terrific here, but you have to have both of them, both those capabilities. So neither one does that bridging, so they'll probably have to find a different mix, etc. So getting that kind of open evolution in an open system just sort of essentially demands that you have to put them to work. You can't just have them sit there and demonstrate. I can run up and down the field very quickly and rapidly. One important kind of thing they could do is specialty support jobs in other organizations' dynamic repository. And this has a separate kind of capability that the other people sort of see and witness their activity. Like our system we built by 1974 had shared screen, that any place in the ARPA network that somebody employing this ran into trouble and they call you up, you can say, okay, go through a little process. All right, now I'm seeing what's happening on your screen. That's good. Oh, okay, I'm seeing what you're doing now. Look, there are a set of things you can do, and I could actually walk your way through it, so pass the controls to me and do it. So we're doing that steadily from 1974. You could publish and talk about it, but it didn't fit paradigms. See? But it's a lot of the things you can do today can provide that sort of thing. But anyway, we have to get faster evolution that's going in this thing. So these are the sort of key deployment. We're going to come back to high-performance teams and give them quite a bit of attention later. And one aspect, though, of doing this is your open hyperdocument system can't do the kind of evolution it does if you have only one interface. So he says, okay, then the architecture for the control of it has to be something that there's a verb-noun interface there that can do anything to anything that anybody wants to do, and you can put whatever interface that you want to that sort of suits people's pursuits. And hey, college kids that really want to try, and the ones that already know how to do skateboarding and everything else like that, get them in there. So having these teams go, and then there's the question of how you deploy them, and that's got pictures for that too, etc. But all this is going to be something about the future in there like that. And with any university, this kind of thing of the integration or something, you'd say, well, high-performance scholarship. So why don't we get NSF turned on about, hey, getting scholarship teams that can say, hey, we can put together a really effective textbook on this field. We can have it almost dynamically updated. It's never more than 2 weeks out of date or something like that. So that's the kind of thing we're going to be needing to do anyway, and it'll be very important for this. And then another whole open source movement is just terrific in its evolution. So it says, all right, that's the way the open hyperdocument system really should evolve. And then it's another really interesting opportunity in it. It says, okay, why doesn't that community live it? So when we built our system, starting from about 1967, starting about the time Jeff Rulison came to work for us, he said, let's move our software on there. And that really turned him on. Thought if it went. So from then on, for the next years, every line of source code is linkable. And any comment field, you can have a link pointing to anything, requirements, user guides, etc. Any of the field reports and problems that can come in. Yet linking in between every passage, any object and any email could link to any other one, or to link to anything else out there. So the way in which the field support could work, boy, the software guy going to do this could write a little memo pointing to the messages that came in and pointing to where the code was probably wrong. And I did some exploring in there, and it seems that our requirements over here were weak on that. So we really ought to make a fix that lifts with these requirements, but modify this requirement so that just very effective in there like that. So anyway, that it's this kind of large-scale sort of, it turns out that there are tactical people out there in the world, and they're strategic. And in the military, they've made a big difference about them. But it's the tactical guys that can take the hill and the battles that suffer to get all the notice out in the business world and stuff like that. So what we have to do is find people that can listen to strategy, and that we have to help co-develop a strategy here that can fit the way the world is. So that's a big part of what we'll be talking about in the future. So instead of letting you go now, let's go and hear Professor Ohashi's lively thing, and when that's done, you're free to move around the country. And I'll look forward very much to talking with you at the reception, and it's just terrific to to have you at least sitting there looking very attentive, because I used to tell the students in the university that I know that's the way you get to be as a professional student. That's all you have to do is look very attentive, but not attentive enough to get called on. Right, and stuff. But anyway, and I probably won't grab you and demand that you participate too much, but I'll urge it. And I hope you get shamed maybe by the people from the outside world that start coming in on email and putting messages in. And in that sense, are developing this, our own Bootstrap Alliance Dynamic Knowledge Repository is a key part of this whole exercise. If we can't get that going, then we'll have missed a very important part of this. And it's going to take more resources than we have now, we know it. So we either have to get money and to be able to hire people, or we have to get volunteers that can be coherently involved with it enough to help do it, because we could get snowed very easily. Like 20 people actively interacting with us could probably bring us to a halt with the staff we have now. So anyway, so here we go. Okay, let's roll on Professor Ohashi.
Of dynamic system. Thank you very much. ちょっとなんか戻して。なんでそんなの？This is our honor to join Engelbart's Colloquium. In Japan, innovation of social system is most important thing recently. And based on Japanese social system is analog system. For example, manufacturing system, quality control, and lean production system, and so on, are based on analog system. Japan has a very high-level educational system, but next century, data society and networking society are made. And this system is based on data system. So we have a next generation system will make many fields, but we have no meta theory. Meta theory is most important thing for the next generation. Engelbart's theory are most suitable for the next generation. Thank you very much.
Very brave of you. One thing I'd like to announce is that one of Professor Ohashi's colleagues, who also was an executive at Sun when all this got started and helped make this happen, has donated one of his sons. So Shinya there standing up behind Peter has been working with us since last fall and will be here another few months and just did a lot of good for us. Fits right in. And then what I'd like to do is get Peter Yim, who is shy about this, to tell everybody a little bit more about what the infrastructure of tools and processes are that we're setting up initially, understaffed, underfunded, to handle this. Do you want to speak on that, Mike, or I'll loan you this one?
Yeah, this is fine. Not quite the process, but the infrastructure at least. I mean, we're back to school here, and this is actually a Stanford course. So I guess just want to go through a few sort of routine requirements. For those of you who have sort of visited the website, the Colloquium site, you would have noticed that there is a certificate requirement. So I mean, you will actually get a Stanford certificate of completion, I mean, for completing the course. Obviously, there are requirements, and I'll try to read them here for everybody. everybody's benefit. One is to have attended a minimum of 9 out of the 10 seminar sessions. You could be here on site, you could be at the broadcast if you are one of the SCPT companies having the microwave broadcast piped into your company, or you could attend the webcast either live or the archival on-demand seminar. So there's sort of 4 or 5 different ways to do it. Secondly, you would need to complete your session evaluation questionnaire, which we are passing out. Virginia is trying to help me pass this out. And lastly, and more importantly, you need to actively participate. And by participate, we mean maybe actively contributing and discussing over cyberspace. Part of the team of volunteers are now setting up a prototype dynamic knowledge repository infrastructure that allows people to engage into threaded discussions, submit links, submit papers, and also do evaluations, surveys, and polls over the net. And hopefully, if we have enough volunteer effort together, we'll put all these into at least a prototype of what Doug envisions as being a dynamic knowledge repository. You will find more information on the website, so please bookmark that. And if you haven't been there yet, the URL is www.bootstrap.org/colloquium, and we will keep on posting more information there. Also, shortly, you will get an invitation message to invite you to join into the threaded discussion. So please join, especially if you want the certificate of completion. But definitely, please join even if you don't want a certificate of completion. One more point of order is for those who are attending the course in person, this is your pass into the auditorium, so don't lose it. It has details as to which sessions you are registered in, so you need this to get back in next week. Obviously, for those who are attending the webcast, you need your passwords, and so don't lose the passwords. I've sent out another message sort of giving people the bookmarked page to access the webcast. If you are attending in person and you also want to go back into the webcast, you would need to register for webcast as well. There is, from the Stanford Colloquium site, where you choose your access. If you choose online webcast, then you will have the registration form to get you registered for webcast and get you your passwords. That's it.
Well, thank you. So that's going to be an important part. We stress that. Are there any sort of operational questions somebody might have? No fair asking me anything substantive. Well, what I'd like to do every time is sort of wave to somebody off. There's a fellow named Dave Evans in Australia. Hi, Dave. See? So Jeff remembers him or something, and he said he's going to be watching, and he promised to try to develop a community going there. So what would be nice is if you people bring to attention people that are around the world that are watching seriously. I know there's the people in Switzerland now already, in Norway too, that would like to do so. I'd like to feel like they're there watching. Okay? So all right, in 20 minutes the reception starts. Is there any, if they get there early, what happens?
Reception starts early.
Okay, so everybody know where the faculty club is? Okay, the class is adjourned.